This is Artemis Launch Control. We are currently 8 hours and 6 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window for the Artemis 2 mission. Now that launch window opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time this evening. Teams do have a 2-hour launch window, which means that if we don't launch right at 6:24, they do have an additional 2 hours in which they can try to launch. Now, the launch team, which we see here on our screen, they're currently in Firing Room 1 at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. They're in the process of loading liquid propellant onto the SLS rocket. Now, it's not just the launch team that's here in the firing room that is helping and is on console for today's launch, but we also have supporting teams across the country that are tuning into this countdown. One of those teams is actually the Artemis Mission Management Team. They recently just got here on console. They have a separate section and room. If you actually look, it's to the right-hand side of our launch director and assistant launch director, Charlie Blackwell Thompson and Jeremy Graber, respectively. Over there on the right-hand side where you kind of see that glass enclosure structure, in there is where our Artemis Mission Management Team will sit for the duration of today's countdown. Now, they just recently arrived on console. And apart from the mission management team, we also have the mission control team at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston and the SLS Engineering and Support Center at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. And this doesn't include the other several contractor locations that are also around the country supporting this launch and this mission. So again, you have our prime main launch team that is here in Firing Room 1, Charlie Blackwell Thompson. You see there she's wearing a green blazer. She's our launch director leading this team. But then there are also supporting teams that are also assisting the launch team throughout today's countdown. That includes the Artemis Mission Management Team, the Mission Control Team in Houston, and the SLS Engineering and Support Center at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, in addition to several contractor locations that are located around the country. Now, as we mentioned, we are currently in our propellant loading operations for the SLS rocket. Teams are currently in fast fill for both core stage liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The core stage is the first stage of the SLS rocket. Here's a great graphic where you can see where we currently are at in our tanking operations. And you'll see above the core stage, we have also started our loading operations in the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. This is the second stage of the SLS rocket. Now, we have not started loading liquid oxygen yet. I'll report out when that is underway. But in the meantime, we are good with, we are in the process of loading liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen on the core stage and liquid hydrogen on the upper stage. I'll report out when we are now starting our liquid oxygen operations on the upper stage. Welcome back. This is Artemis Launch Control. We're currently 8 hours and 1 minute and counting from the opening of today's launch window for the Artemis 2 mission. I'm Antonia Jaramillo in NASA Communications, and I, along with our fellow commentators, will be taking you through today's countdown. And actually joining me currently in the room here in Firing Room 1 is our Assistant Launch Director, Jeremy Graver. Jeremy, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
No problem. Good morning, Tony. Happy to be here.
You know, Jeremy, I think we recently heard the call out that our flight crew, our astronauts, they just got their wake-up call. Can you run us through kind of what the rest of the day now looks like for them?
Absolutely, yeah. They were woken up just a little while ago. They'll get up as most of us do on a busy, exciting day. Get up, they'll get their breakfast. They'll kind of get into the groove of the day. They'll go through multiple meetings and discussions just to understand where we are. In a little while, the launch director and our flight director will provide a weather briefing for the flight crew to talk about all of the weather potentials that could play into today's launch opportunity. Once that's complete, they will then start getting suited up, and they'll head to the suit room, start doing all their preparations from a suit up perspective. As that's completed, they'll be checking with us to make sure that we're ready for them to come to the pad. And then they'll be on their way, headed out to the pad in the Astrovan, ready to get out to Launchpad 39B, get up on top of the mobile launcher onto the 274-foot level, go across the crew access arm into the White Room, and enter the Orion spacecraft. So we're really excited for those events later today.
It is. It's a very busy and exciting day, like you mentioned. I hope they got some good rest and didn't, wake up a bunch of times throughout the night. I know I certainly did, but just because of pure excitement, like you mentioned. Now let's shift focus back on the rocket. How's propellant loading going?
Everything is going very well right now. As I stepped off console to come in here, the core stage LH2 tank was about 95% loaded. The upper stage is probably about halfway and moving towards their completion for LH2. The liquid oxygen side of the core stage is in fast fill as well, and proceeding well, and we will be getting into the upper stage LO2 loading in a little while. So all things moving per schedule, and working towards that plan for the day.
That is great news. And actually, I think we just heard that they got the go for transitioning into that liquid hydrogen on the core stage 2 topping. So like you said, we're getting very close.
Absolutely.
That is exciting, so can you tell us a little bit then about those upcoming milestones once we finish that propellant loading on all 4 tanks?
Yeah, so it's absolutely critical for us to get into what we call stable replenish on all stages. And what that means is the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen tanks on both the core stage and the interim cryopropulsion stage, or ICPS, are fully loaded, and we are just maintaining that level of loading. And that's a very quiescent configuration for us, and that's required for us to be in that configuration to then be allowed to send the flight crew, our closeout crew, which is there to assist the flight crew getting on board Orion. We need to be in that stable replenish configuration to be able to send those crews out to the launch pad. And as we send those crews out, that is really our press and our push to launch. We'll get the crew on board. They go through a number of checks, communication checks, system checks, and then our closeout crew's job is to back out of the crew module, close all of our hatches, get us in configuration to be able to then the closeout crew to leave the pad. And that puts us in the configuration to allow us to proceed through the rest of launch countdown as we proceed down to our final hold at T-minus 10 minutes, where we do all of our launch polls and determine that we are ready to pick up with what we call terminal count, which is from T-minus 10 minutes down to launch at T0. And really excited to get to all of those milestones as we proceed through the day.
We are all very excited. We're rooting for you guys, watching along. And as you mentioned, the reason to get to all stages replenished first is because that's the point where we're at the safest configuration to send people back to the launch pad, correct?
That is absolutely correct. It is a very stable configuration. It's the safe configuration that we require to ensure that we're ready to send those crews out to the pad.
Jeremy Graver, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We're rooting for you, wishing you the best of luck, and we'll let you get back on console.
Excellent. Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it. Go Artemis.
Go Artemis. All right, and so just to quickly recap, we are now in our topping phase for liquid hydrogen on the core stage. We are still in fast fill on the liquid oxygen side for the core stage, and also fast fill for the upper stage liquid hydrogen tank. I'll report back once we have entered our topping phase for liquid oxygen on the core stage. This is Artemis Launch Control. We are currently 7 hours and 47 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window for NASA's Artemis 2 mission. That launch window opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time this evening. Now, the teams do have a 2-hour launch window, so that means if we can't launch right at 6:24, that's okay. They still have an additional 2 hours in which they can attempt to launch. Now, currently, the Artemis launch team, which you see on your screen there, they are in the process of loading cryogenic or super cold liquid propellant onto the SLS, or the Space Launch System rocket. The teams actually just reported that we have completed loading liquid hydrogen onto the core stage of the rocket. Now, the core stage is the first stage of that SLS rocket. There's a great graphic representation of where we currently are in our tanking operations. So as you see, we are at 100% level for the liquid hydrogen tank on the core stage. So that means we are now, the teams are just going to be constantly replenishing that tank as some of that as some of that liquid starts boiling off into a gas due to the temperatures as it starts warming up. So teams will therefore replenish it constantly to maintain this 100% flight level. Now, as you can see, right above the hydrogen tank sits our liquid oxygen tank. That's currently 70% of the way filled. And then on our upper stage, or the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, this is the rocket stage that sits on top of the core stage. We are currently in our fast fill operations for liquid hydrogen on that upper stage. Teams have not started liquid oxygen for the upper stage. And that is totally normal. That is part of the countdown. We aren't scheduled to start our upper stage liquid oxygen loading operations until we start getting into, so we get much further into our loading operations for the liquid oxygen tank on the core stage. So again, we are now in replenish for the core stage liquid hydrogen tank, and we are in fast fill for the liquid oxygen tank on the core stage and the liquid hydrogen tank on the upper stage. Now, a quick recap on how the whole tanking loading process goes. Teams will first start with what is called chill down. So prior to us actually starting to load the super cold propellant onto the rocket, they will first chill down all of the systems and lines. This is done to make sure that it is able to receive these super cold temperatures. In order for hydrogen to be in a liquid state, it needs to be negative 423 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen in a liquid state is negative 297 degrees Fahrenheit. So very, very cold temperatures. And as such, we want to make sure that we are conditioning all of the systems to be able to receive those cryogenic temperatures so that we aren't shocking the hardware and we're not causing any potential damage unnecessarily. Now, following chill down, we will transition into what is called into slow fill on the core stage. Now, slow fill, as the name suggests, refers to slowly starting to feed that propellant onto the rocket. This officially marks the start of our propellant loading. Teams actually got into slow fill for the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen tanks on the core stage earlier this morning, a little bit before 9 a.m. Following slow fill is then when we transition into fast fill. This is where we stay for the majority of our tanking loading operations. Similarly to slow fill, fast fill refers to loading propellant at a much faster rate. And that is currently where the liquid oxygen tank state is in. We are in fast fill for liquid oxygen tank on the core stage. Now, after fast fill, we transition into topping. This is the last little bit that is needed to fill the tanks to 100% level. Hence why we're topping it off. Following topping, we are now at 100%. And so now we transition into replenish mode. Replenish just means we're going to be constantly replenishing these tanks so that we make sure we are again at 100% flight level. Now you see on your screen there, we can see some venting coming off the rocket. This is totally expected as we begin our loading operations. Some of that liquid propellant starts warming up. It'll start to boil off and vent outside of the rocket. Hence why we see some of that gas getting expended from down underneath where the engines are at the bottom, and also a little bit at the top where the upper stage is located. So again, an expected condition. Now let's take you through the rocket a little bit. See up there on your screen, we have the Orion spacecraft. Underneath there is the Orion stage adapter. The Orion stage adapter is what houses our secondary payloads, or these scientific CubeSats. They're shoebox-sized scientific experiments that will go to space following separation from the upper stage and the spacecraft. It's also the smallest section of the SLS rocket at only 5 feet. Underneath the Orion stage adapter sits the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, or that second stage. Underneath there is our core stage, or the first stage of the rocket. Now the core stage, it consists of the propellant tanks, the ducts, the valves, avionics, and it also houses the 4 RS-25 engines that are down there at the bottom. Next to the core stage, we have our 2 solid rocket boosters. Each is taller than the Statue of Liberty. Now on those rocket boosters, you can see our NASA worm. The worm logo spans 25 feet end to end, or roughly the length of 1 booster motor segment. Now we actually have 5 segments each on each booster, so 10 segments total. It's actually 1 segment more than what was used during the space shuttle program. Now you should also be able to see some black and white markings around the rocket. Now these are used for imagery for the SLS engineering and support team that's based out at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. They use this for imagery to track and guide the rocket after liftoff and during ascent. And it will also be used in their post-flight analysis. Now, the orange color of the core stage is the thermal protection system, or that spray-on foam insulation. Now, this provides the thermal protection for every part of the rocket. And when the foam is applied, it gives the rocket this light yellow color that the sun's ultraviolet rays eventually tan, giving our SLS rocket its famous butterscotch color. So again, to quickly recap, we are in replenish mode for the core stage liquid hydrogen tank. We are about 75% of the way filled on our liquid oxygen tank on the core stage. But we're still in fast fill. I'll let you know when we transition into topping for the core stage liquid oxygen tank. And then on the upper stage, teams are also in fast fill for liquid hydrogen. And they have not started the liquid oxygen operations on the upper stage yet. I'll make sure to report out all of these milestones as they're underway. This is Artemis Launch Control. We are currently 7 hours and 30 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window for the Artemis II mission. That launch window opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time, and teams do have a 2-hour launch window, which means that if we don't launch right at the beginning at 6:24, they do have an additional 2 hours in which they can attempt to launch. Our launch team is currently in Firing Room 1 at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida and are in the process of loading cryogenic or super cold liquid propellant onto the SLS or the Space Launch System rocket. Now, teams did just complete fast fill for the liquid hydrogen tank on the upper stage, or our interim cryogenic propulsion stage. Now, fast fill refers to loading propellant at a faster rate. This is preceded by chill down, which gets the system ready to receive these super cold temperatures. And then following fast fill, teams will then transition into topping and replenish. I'll get more into those, but before that, again, we just finished fast fill for the liquid hydrogen tank on the upper stage, and teams are now performing, before they start topping, what is called a vented relief test. This test is basically just pressurizing the upper stage tanks with heliums to test the relief capabilities of the tank pressure to make sure that it can handle that pressure capability during flight. So between fast fill and topping, teams will perform this test on both the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen tanks on the upper stage. Following that test completion, we will then transition into topping, which just means finishing loading the rest of the tank to 100%. Following topping, we enter what is called replenish mode, which basically just means that now we are going to be replenishing these tanks at 100% level, because as we naturally get throughout the countdown, that propellant is going to start warming up and it'll start boiling and venting up, as you can see on your screen there what is happening. So because of that, and because the teams want to make sure that they still have 100% level in all 4 tanks, the 2 on the upper stage and the 2 on the core stage, or the first stage of the rocket, they continuously replenish the tanks until the final 10 minutes of the launch countdown, or what is known as terminal count. Now, speaking of replenish mode, we are currently in replenish mode for the core stage liquid hydrogen tank. So we were just talking about how we finished fast fill on the upper stage liquid hydrogen tank. We are also then in replenish mode for the core stage liquid hydrogen tank. On the liquid oxygen side, we are still in fast fill for the core stage liquid oxygen. And then on the upper stage, we haven't started those liquid oxygen operations yet. The teams want to wait until we are a little bit further along in the core stage liquid oxygen loading operations before we transition into that upper stage loading operation. Now, in total, the SLS and Orion rocket and Orion spacecraft are 322 feet tall. At liftoff, SLS produces 8.8 million pounds of thrust. A little bit more than the Saturn V rocket that was used during the Apollo missions, which were roughly 7.5 million pounds of thrust to send those astronauts to the moon. With our SLS rocket, though, you don't just have those liquid fuel tanks that are fueling the rocket, but you also have 2 solid rocket boosters that are attached on either side. You see there on your screen right there? They also help provide that extra push and that thrust right at liftoff. Now, Let's go up a little bit on the rocket, go back to our upper or our second stage, our interim cryogenic propulsion stage. For those that have been following us along since Artemis 1, you might remember that the interim cryogenic propulsion stage for Artemis 1 provided the big push to send the Orion spacecraft on its way to the moon. For Artemis 2, however, it's going to be a little different. And the reason for that is because Artemis 2 is NASA's first crewed test flight, meaning we are sending astronauts on board this rocket for the first time. And because of that, we are going to have the capability to practice a bunch of different systems and tests and operations that we couldn't do if it were uncrewed. One of these operations is what is called the proximity operation demonstration. This involves the upper stage, or that interim cryogenic propulsion stage, and the Orion spacecraft practicing proximity maneuvers where the Orion spacecraft will practice approaching and getting away from the upper stage in a high Earth orbit. The reason teams want to practice this is in preparation for Artemis 3 and future Artemis missions for when Orion docks with our lunar landing systems. And so because of this, this means that the interim cryogenic propulsion stage will be separating from Orion much sooner. Meaning that following this demonstration, it will be Orion's European service module that will actually send the spacecraft on its trajectory to the moon. It will perform what is called the translunar injection burn. Now, this proximity operation is scheduled to happen during the first day of flight, so pretty soon. And NASA will be providing you with 24/7 live coverage starting right now as we have been going through our propellant loading operations, and we will continue throughout the course of the entire mission, including all of the splashdown operations. Artemis 2 will send NASA astronauts Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Christina Cook, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen on a 10-day mission around the moon and back. Orion is scheduled to splash down off the coast of San Diego in the Pacific Ocean. So to quickly recap, teams are in the process of performing a vent and relief test on the liquid hydrogen tank on the upper stage, following finishing their fast fill operations. Again, this test is to just test the tanks that they can handle the pressure that will be happening during this first day of flight. Following this test, we will then transition into our topping phase on the upper stage liquid hydrogen tank, and it'll then transition to replenish. On the core stage, meanwhile, we are still in fast fill for the liquid oxygen tank, and we are in replenish for liquid hydrogen. Now, this is a very, very big and important milestone to me because, again, for those that have been following us along, especially with Artemis 2, during our fast fill operations on the core stage liquid hydrogen tank during wet dress rehearsal 1, that was our first test of this Artemis 2 moon rocket where we tested loading the propellants on board. Teams experienced the liquid hydrogen leaks shortly after getting into fast fill during that first test. They then performed a second wet dress rehearsal where they did not see any major leaks. Tanking loading operations went very smoothly, and it was a very successful test. And so it's great to see that throughout today's countdown for launch, there also weren't any significant issues or leaks reported during our liquid hydrogen loading phase on the core stage. So we are now in replenish mode for liquid hydrogen. We're about 84% of the way on the liquid oxygen tank. And we're also almost there on the upper stage for liquid hydrogen. Now I'll report out once liquid oxygen operations for the upper stage are also underway. Welcome back. This is Artemis Launch Control. We are currently 7 hours and 9 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window for the Artemis 2 mission. Our Artemis launch team is currently in the process of loading liquid propellant onto the SLS, or Space Launch System, rocket. Teams just reported out that we are in our topping phase. For the upper stage liquid hydrogen tank, this means we are almost at 100%, if not pretty much there on that upper stage tank. The upper stage is the second stage of the SLS rocket. Here's a graphic representation where we can see where we're currently at in our tanking operations. That means we have now finished loading our liquid hydrogen on both the core stage and the upper stage. As I said, we're in that topping phase to get us to 100%. And afterwards, we'll then transition into replenish mode to stay at 100% level. You can see on the core stage, we are already at the replenish mode. If you see that 100% level right there. And we also just got confirmation that we are also in replenish for the upper stage liquid hydrogen tank. Now on the liquid oxygen side, we still have a little bit to go. We're almost there on the liquid oxygen tank for the core stage. You see roughly 92% of the way filled. And we haven't started our liquid oxygen propellant loading operations on the upper stage. Teams are getting ready to start chilling down that tank. Teams do this to make sure that all of the systems and lines are ready to receive these cryogenic temperatures. As you can see on your screen there, for hydrogen to stay in a liquid state, it must be negative 423 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen, meanwhile, is negative 297 degrees Fahrenheit. So these super, super cold temperatures, we want to make sure that the rocket is able to receive them without damaging any of the hardware on board. So we'll start with chilling down that liquid oxygen tank and lines before we actually start loading it onto the upper stage. I'll report back once that step is underway. As a reminder, our launch window opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time this evening. Teams do have a 2-hour launch window, so that means if we don't launch right at 6:24, that is okay. They still have additional opportunities throughout that 2-hour launch window. Now, NASA's providing 24/7 live coverage throughout this entire mission, beginning with our propellant loading operations that is currently underway. And as we continue our coverage this morning, we are also, and we continue monitoring all of our loading operations. We thank you for following us along. Part of our live coverage will, of course, include our launch this evening. That live launch coverage for Artemis 2 will continue right here at the beginning at approximately 12:50 p.m. Eastern Time. You can continue watching on our NASA's YouTube channel, as well as on NASA Plus and the other NASA social media channels. Again, we are providing 24/7 live coverage. So following launch, the show doesn't end there. We have a 10-day mission around the moon. And then following that, we're coming back home. And we will be covering all of those splashdown operations as well. Artemis 2 is a test flight. It is NASA's first crewed Artemis mission. We will be sending NASA astronauts Reed Wiseman, who serves as the commander, Victor Glover, the pilot, and mission specialist Christina Cook. And then we're also sending Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen, who serves as the other mission specialist for this mission. So to quickly recap, we are in replenish for both liquid hydrogen tanks on the core stage and the upper stage of our SLS or Space Launch System rocket. And we are getting very close to being almost all the way full on the liquid oxygen tank in the core stage. I'll make sure to report out once we start entering topping for the liquid oxygen tank in the core stage. Again, that refers to the last little bit that is needed to get us to 100%. And I'll also make sure to let folks know when our chill down operations are in work on the upper stage liquid oxygen tank. As a reminder, all of this propellant that are on board these 4 tanks of these two rocket stages, they feed the engines that are underneath and then provide the power and the push to send the Orion spacecraft on its voyage to the moon.
Ahora con Fibra Max disfruta de 1000 megas por solo $17,50 más impuestos. Las tareas y consultas de tus peques sin interrupciones. Tus series y películas con una conexión estable y con la menor latencia del país. Y lo mejor, al activar tu servicio, participas en el sorteo de uno de los Wi-Fi dorados, con internet gratis para toda la vida. Activa tu plan ahora y podrás ser uno de los afortunados ganadores.
Fibra Max, Fibra Max, Fibra Max, Fibra Max.
Ahora con Fibra Max disfruta